The young man walked down the dimly lit street, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. He had no idea that his act of kindness was about to plunge him into a world of danger. It had all started earlier that day, when he was scrounging for spare change, desperate to find a few dollars to buy a meal. As he roamed the back alleys, he stumbled upon a well-dressed young man sitting alone on a bench, head in his hands. Without hesitation, the young man approached him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. The other man looked up, his eyes red from crying. I don't have any money for food," he stammered. "I'm still hungry." The young man's heart went out to him. "Here, let me buy you something to eat," he said, and led the stranger to a nearby diner. As they sat across from each other in the small, dimly lit establishment, the young man couldn't help but notice how the other man seemed to carry himself with a certain air of confidence, despite his evident distress. There was something about him that was both intriguing and unsettling. "Thank you for your kindness," the stranger said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Frankie." "It's nice to meet you, Frankie," the young man replied, offering a warm smile. "I'm just glad I could help." As they ate their meals in relative silence, the young man couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Frankie than met the eye. He was about to ask him a question when Frankie suddenly spoke up. "You know, you're a good guy," he said, his gaze fixed on the young man. Not many people would have stopped to help a stranger like that. The young man felt a shiver run down his spine at Frankie's intense stare. I was just trying to do the right thing," he stammered. Frankie nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Well, I appreciate it," he said, "and I'd like to do something for you in return." The young man's eyes widened. "Oh, no, that's not necessary," he said quickly. "I was just trying to help." But Frankie was insistent. "Please, I insist," he said, his voice taking on a more commanding tone. "Let me take you to dinner with my father tomorrow night. It's the least I can do." The young man hesitated, his instincts telling him to decline the offer. But the prospect of a free meal and the chance to spend time with someone who seemed to have influence and power was too tempting to pass up. "All right, I'll do it," he said, a sense of unease settling in the pit of his stomach. That night, as the young man lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. Who was Frankie, and what kind of father did he have? He tossed and turned, his mind racing with questions and concerns. The next evening, Frankie arrived at the young man's apartment, a sleek black car waiting outside. As they drove through the city, the young man couldn't help but notice the way Frankie carried himself, the subtle air of authority that seemed to emanate from him.
When they arrived at their destination, the young man was awestruck. The mansion they pulled up to was massive, its ornate facade gleaming in the moonlight. Frankie led him through the grand entryway and into a lavish dining room, where a well-dressed man sat at the head of the table. "Father, this is the young man I told you about," Frankie said, his voice soft but commanding. The older man turned to face them, his piercing gaze sending a chill down the young man's spine. "So, you're the one who helped my son?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. Yes, sir," the young man stammered, suddenly feeling very small and out of place. The man nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Well, I must say, I'm impressed by your act of kindness," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "It's not often that I encounter such selflessness in this city." The young man felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, sir," he said, relaxing slightly. But as the evening wore on, the young man couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. The way that Don, as Frankie had referred to him, spoke and carried himself was unnerving, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to grow increasingly tense. When the meal was finished, the Don turned to the young man, his gaze unwavering. "You know, I'm a man who values loyalty and discretion above all else," he said, his voice low and serious. "And I can't help but wonder, what exactly do you know about my business?" The young man's heart raced, and he struggled to find the right words. I don't know anything, sir," he stammered. "I was just trying to help your son." The Don leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. "Well, I appreciate your honesty," he said, his tone making it clear that he wasn't entirely convinced. As the young man was escorted out of the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. He knew that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and that the Don would not be so quick to forget his act of kindness. That night, as the young man lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with the events of the evening. He knew that he had to get out of the city to escape the grasp of the Don and his empire. But as he reached for his phone to make a plan, a sudden knock at the door made him freeze in terror. Trembling, the young man approached the door, peering through the peephole. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was Frankie, flanked by two large, intimidating men. Without a moment's hesitation, the young man turned and fled, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran through the dark alleys, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the mansion as possible. But as he rounded a corner, he found himself face to face with another group of men, all of them wearing the same distinctive suits and ties that he had seen at the Don's table.
Panic gripped the young man as he realized that he was trapped, surrounded by the Don's men on all sides. He knew that his act of kindness had sealed his fate, and that he was now a marked man, a pawn in a dangerous game that he never wanted to be a part of. As the men closed in on him, the young man knew that his life was about to take a turn for the worse. He had stumbled into the world of the Italian Mafia, and now he would have to fight for his very survival. The young man's heart pounded in his chest as he fled down the dimly lit street, the sound of his pounding footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. He had thought he was doing a good deed, helping the stranger Frankie, but now he found himself trapped in a world of danger. As he turned the corner, he came face to face with a group of intimidating men in suits, all of them wearing the same distinctive ties he had seen at the Don's mansion. Panic gripped him as he realized he was surrounded, with no way to escape. The men closed in, their eyes cold and calculating. The young man braced himself, ready to fight for his life. But just as they were about to grab him, a sudden commotion from behind caught everyone's attention. A shrill scream pierced the air, followed by the sound of screeching tires. The men turned to see a car careening down the street, its headlights blazing. In the blink of an eye, the car swerved and slammed into the group of men, sending them flying in all directions. The young man watched in stunned disbelief as the car came to a screeching halt, the driver's door flying open. To his utter shock, Frankie emerged, his face contorted in a mix of fear and determination. "Get in," Frankie yelled, his voice laced with urgency. Without hesitation, the young man jumped into the car, his heart racing. As they sped away, Frankie's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "What's going on?" the young man asked, his voice trembling. Frankie glanced at him, his eyes wild. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." The young man's mind raced with questions, but before he could speak, Frankie continued. "My father, the Don, he's a dangerous man, and I've been keeping a terrible secret from him." Frankie's voice cracked, and the young man could see the fear in his eyes. "What secret?" the young man asked, his heart pounding. Frankie took a deep breath, his hands shaking. I'm not my father's biological son. I'm his adopted son, and he doesn't know the truth about my mother." The young man stared at Frankie, his mouth agape. "What are you saying?" Frankie's eyes filled with tears. "My mother was one of my father's enemies. She was a member of a rival crime family, and she had an affair with my father. When he found out, he had her killed." The young man felt a chill run down his spine. "And you're telling me this because—" Frankie's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Because I found out the truth, and I've been living in fear of my father ever since. I knew that if he ever found out, he would kill me." The young man's heart sank. "So why did you bring me into this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frankie's eyes met his, filled with desperation. "I don't know. I guess I thought that if I could get you to like me, to trust me, maybe you could help me escape. But now—" He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The young man felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over him. He had thought he was helping a stranger in need, but instead he had been dragged into a twisted web of lies and deception. As they drove through the city, Frankie's phone suddenly rang.
The young man watched as Frankie's face drained of color, his hands shaking as he answered the call. "Father!" Frankie's voice trembled. The young man could hear the Don's booming voice from the other end of the line, even though he couldn't make out the words. Frankie's eyes widened and he slammed on the brakes, pulling the car over to the side of the road. I didn't know, Father. I swear." Frankie's voice was frantic, his desperation palpable. The young man's heart raced as he watched the exchange, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just learned. Suddenly, Frankie let out a guttural scream, his phone slipping from his hand as he collapsed against the steering wheel. The young man stared in horror as Frankie's body convulsed, blood seeping from a bullet wound in his chest. In a matter of seconds, the car had been surrounded by a horde of the Don's men, all of them wielding guns and wearing the same distinctive suits and ties. The young man's blood ran cold as the car door was wrenched open and he found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. He knew that his life was about to come to a sudden and violent end, and he braced himself for the inevitable. But just as the gunman was about to pull the trigger, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Stop!" The young man's eyes widened as a figure emerged, stepping into the dim light. It was the Don himself, his face a mask of fury. "What's the meaning of this?" the Don demanded, his voice laced with menace. The gunman hesitated, his grip on the weapon wavering. "But, sir, he's the one who—" "I said stop!" the Don bellowed, his eyes narrowing. "This one is mine to deal with." The young man watched in stunned silence as the Don approached the car, his gaze fixed on Frankie's lifeless body. A strange mix of emotions flickered across the Don's face. Grief, rage, and something else the young man couldn't quite place. Slowly, the Don reached down and gently closed Frankie's eyes, his fingers lingering on his son's face. Then, without a word, he turned to the young man, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the young man's blood run cold. "You," the Don said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were the one who was supposed to save him." The young man's mind raced, trying to make sense of the Don's words. What are you talking about?" The Don's expression hardened, and he took a step closer to the young man. "Frankie was my son, my heir, and you—" He paused, his gaze piercing the young man's soul. "You were the one who was meant to help him escape this life." The young man's mouth went dry, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't understand." The Don's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Of course you don't. How could you?" He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Frankie was a fool, and now he's paid the ultimate price for his foolishness." The young man's mind reeled, trying to process the Don's words. "But why me? Why did you want me to help him?" The Don's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you, my young friend, are the key to my undoing." The young man felt a chill run down his spine, the weight of the Don's words sinking in. He had been thrust into a game of power and betrayal, a twisted chess match where his life was the pawn. As the Don's men surrounded him, the young man knew that his fate was now sealed. He had stumbled into a world of darkness, and there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, he knew that his life would never be the same. Here is a continuation of the story, approximately 1,600 words, with a shocking plot twist. The young man sat in the back seat of the car, his hand shaking as the Don's men surrounded him. He had no idea what was going to happen, but he knew it couldn't be good. The Don's words had sent a chill down his spine. Was he really the key to his undoing? As the Don approached the car, the young man braced himself, preparing for the worst. But to his surprise, the Don simply opened the door and gestured for him to get out. "Come with me," the Don said, his voice low and commanding. The young man hesitated for a moment, but the cold stares of the Don's men quickly convinced him to comply. He stepped out of the car and followed the Don, his heart pounding in his chest. They walked in silence through the dimly lit streets, the only sound the echo of their footsteps. The young man couldn't help but notice the way the Don carried himself, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. There was an aura of power and authority about him that was both intimidating and intriguing. Finally, they reached a nondescript building, and the Don led the young man inside. The interior was simple, with bare walls and a sparse decor. The young man couldn't help but feel a sense of ease as the Don ushered him into a small room and gestured for him to sit. "Make yourself comfortable," the Don said, his tone neutral. "We have much to discuss." The young man did as he was told, perching on the edge of the chair and trying to keep his composure.
He had no idea what the Don had in store for him, but he knew that he couldn't afford to show any weakness.
The Don paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "You're probably wondering why I've brought you here," he said, his gaze fixed on the young man. The young man swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The Don paused, his eyes narrowing. "You see, my son Frankie was a troubled individual. He had a secret, one that he was too afraid to share with me." The young man felt a knot of dread forming in the pit of his stomach. He knew where this was going, and he didn't like it one bit. "Frankie was not my biological son," the Don continued, his voice tinged with sadness. "He was the product of an affair I had with a woman who was my sworn enemy." The young man's eyes widened in shock. He had suspected as much, but hearing the words from the Don himself made it all the more real. "Frankie knew the truth, and he lived in constant fear that I would find out," the Don said, his gaze drifting to the floor. "He thought that by bringing you into our lives, he could find a way to escape his fate." The young man felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "So you used me, just like he did," he spat, his voice laced with bitterness. The Don's eyes snapped back at the young man, his expression hardening. "No, that's not the case at all," he said, his voice firm. "I had a plan, a way to save Frankie from the life I had condemned him to." The young man stared at the Don, confusion and disbelief written all over his face. "Save him? But he's dead." The Don nodded solemnly. "Yes, he is. And that is my greatest regret." He paused, his gaze distant. "I never wanted this for him, you know? I wanted him to have a chance at a better life, away from the darkness that has consumed my own." The young man felt a lump forming in his throat. He had never expected to feel any sympathy for the Don, but the genuine grief in his voice was undeniable. "So, what does that have to do with me?" the young man asked. His curiosity piqued despite his better judgment. The Don fixed him with a piercing stare. "You, my young friend, were the key to Frankie's escape. You were the one he was supposed to trust, the one who was meant to help him disappear and start a new life." The young man shook his head, his mind racing. "But why me? Why did you choose me?" The Don sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Because you are an outsider, someone who has no connection to our world. You were the perfect person to help Frankie break free from the chains of our legacy." The young man felt a chill run down his spine. "And now that Frankie is dead, what happens to me?" The Don's expression hardened, and the young man felt his heart skip a beat. "That, my friend, is where things get complicated." Before the young man could respond, the door to the room burst open, and a figure strode in. The young man's eyes widened in shock as he recognized the newcomer. It was Frankie, alive and well.
"Father," Frankie said, his voice low and steady, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you do this." The Don's face darkened, and he turned to face his son. "Frankie, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice laced with fury. Frankie stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I've been working with the authorities, Father. They know the truth about my mother's murder, and they're prepared to bring you down." The young man felt his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the exchange. He had no idea what was going on, but it was clear that the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The Don's expression twisted into a mask of rage, and he lunged towards Frankie, his hands outstretched as if to strangle him. But before he could reach his son, the door burst open again, and a group of heavily armed men in tactical gear stormed the room. "Freeze! This is the FBI!" one of the men shouted, his weapon trained on the Don. The young man watched in stunned silence as the Don was wrestled to the ground and handcuffed, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief.
Frankie stood by, a grim expression on his face, as the agents secured the Don and led him away. Once the commotion had died down, Frankie turned to the young man, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of relief and regret. "I'm sorry you got caught up in all of this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was never my intention to drag you into my family's mess." The young man stared at Frankie, his mind reeling. "So it was all a setup? A way to take down your own father?" Frankie nodded solemnly. "Yes, that's right. I've been working with the FBI for months, gathering evidence and building a case against my father. I knew that I couldn't escape his reach on my own, so I had to find a way to bring him down from the inside." The young man felt a surge of mixed emotions, anger, confusion, and a strange sense of admiration for Frankie's bravery and resilience. "But why me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why did you involve me in all of this?" Frankie sighed, his gaze drifting to the floor. I needed someone on the outside, someone my father would trust, and when I saw how kind and compassionate you were, I knew you were the perfect person to help me." The young man shook his head, his mind racing. "So everything, from the diner to the dinner at your father's mansion, it was all part of your plan?" Frankie nodded solemnly. "Yes, I'm afraid so. I never meant to put you in danger, but I knew that I had to take that risk if I wanted to finally break free from my father's shadow." The young man felt a surge of mixed emotions, anger, disbelief, and a strange sense of admiration for Frankie's bravery and resilience. He had been used, manipulated, and thrown into a world of darkness, but in the end, Frankie had managed to take down the Don, the most powerful and feared criminal in the city.
As the young man watched the FBI agents escort the Don away, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would he be free to go? Or would he be caught up in the aftermath of Frankie's plan? And what would become of Frankie himself, now that he had betrayed his own father? The young man's head was spinning, and he felt a sense of unease settle in the pit of his stomach. He had stumbled into a world of darkness, and he knew that he would never be the same again. But as he looked at Frankie, he couldn't help but feel a sense of respect, and even a hint of gratitude. "So, what happens now?" the young man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frankie turned to him, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "That, my friend, is the biggest question of all." The young man braced himself, knowing that whatever came next, his life would be forever changed by this unexpected and shocking turn of events. The young man stared at Frankie, his mind reeling from the shocking revelations. Just moments ago, he had witnessed the downfall of the ruthless Don, the powerful Mafia boss who had sought to manipulate him. But now, he found himself facing an even greater uncertainty. What was going to happen to him now? Frankie let out a heavy sigh and ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his own nervousness. "I'm afraid it's not going to be easy from here on out," he said, his voice laced with apprehension. The young man swallowed hard, bracing himself for whatever was to come. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Frankie's gaze flickered to the door where the FBI agents had taken the Don away. "The authorities have been after my father for years, but they've never been able to get enough evidence to bring him down. Until now, that is." The young man nodded, his mind racing. "So, does that mean I'm in the clear? That I won't be charged with anything?" Frankie's expression darkened, and the young man felt a chill run down his spine. "I wish I could tell you that, but the truth is, you're still in a very precarious position." "What are you saying?" the young man asked, his voice trembling. Frankie took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. "The FBI, they're not just after my father. They're after anyone who's been involved with his criminal empire, including you." The young man felt his stomach drop, the reality of the situation sinking in. "But I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help you, and now you're telling me I could be in trouble?" Frankie nodded solemnly. "I know, and I'm truly sorry for that. But the FBI doesn't see it that way. In their eyes, you're an accomplice, someone who was willing to help a member of the Mafia." The young man shook his head, panic starting to set in. No, this can't be happening. I have to get out of here. I have to." Frankie reached out and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring.
"Hey, calm down. I'm not going to let them take you, all right? I owe you too much for that." The young man felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the uncertainty in Frankie's voice. "What are you going to do?" he asked,
his voice barely above a whisper. Frankie's expression hardened, and the young man could see the gears turning in his mind. I have a plan, but it's risky, very risky. The young man felt his heart sink. What kind of plan? He asked, dreading the answer. Frankie glanced over his shoulder, making sure they were alone. I'm going to get you out of here, but you'll have to trust me completely. Can you do that? The young man hesitated, his instincts telling him to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But something in Frankie's eyes, a fierce determination that the young man had never seen before, made him pause. I don't know, the young man admitted, his voice barely audible. Frankie leaned in, his gaze unwavering. Listen to me. This is the only way. If you stay here, the FBI will arrest you, and there's no telling what kind of charges they'll bring against you. But if you come with me, I can get you out of the city, out of their reach. The young man felt a knot of dread forming in the pit of his stomach. But what about you? What will happen to you? Frankie's expression darkened, and the young man knew that the answer was not going to be a good one. I'm not sure, Frankie admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. All I know is that I can't let them take you down for my mistakes. The young man stared at Frankie, torn between his desire for safety and the nagging feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. Frankie, I don't know if I can do this. It's too risky, too... Suddenly, the door burst open and a group of FBI agents stormed into the room, their weapons drawn. Freeze! Hands in the air, both of you! One of them shouted. Frankie's eyes widened, and he grabbed the young man's arm, pulling him towards the back of the room. We have to go, now! He yelled, his voice laced with desperation. The young man's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Frankie, his mind racing with a million different thoughts. He knew that this was his last chance to escape, to leave this nightmare behind. But the risk was so great, the consequences so uncertain. As they reached the back of the room, Frankie spotted a window and quickly pushed it open. This is our way out, he said, his voice urgent. You have to trust me, please. The young man hesitated, his gaze darting back to the advancing agents. He could hear their shouts, their footsteps thundering closer. He knew that if he stayed, he would almost certainly be arrested, but the thought of fleeing with Frankie filled him with a sense of dread. Frankie, the young man started, his voice trembling. But before he could finish, a loud bang echoed through the room, and the young man felt a searing pain in his shoulder.
He cried out, his knees buckling as he collapsed to the floor. Frankie's eyes widened in horror, and he immediately dropped to the young man's side, pressing his hands against the wound to stem the bleeding. No, 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 he shouted, his voice laced with panic. The young man could feel the warm blood seeping through Frankie's fingers, and he knew that time was running out. The FBI agents were closing in, their weapons still drawn and ready to fire. Frankie, the young man gasped, his vision starting to blur. You have to go. You have to... But Frankie shook his head, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. I'm not leaving you behind, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're in this together, no matter what. The young man wanted to protest, to tell Frankie to save himself, but the pain was overwhelming and his strength was fading fast. As the FBI agents surrounded them, Frankie looked up, his gaze defiant. Stand down, one of the agents shouted. We've got you surrounded, Frankie. There's no way out of this. Frankie's grip on the young man tightened, and the young man could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. Please, Frankie begged, his voice cracking. He's innocent. He didn't... But his words were cut short by the sound of more gunfire, and the young man felt Frankie's body go limp, blood splattering across his face. As the world around him faded to black, the young man could only think one thing. This can't be happening. It can't end like this. But the harsh reality was undeniable. He had been dragged into a deadly game of cat and mouse, and now, trapped in the crossfire, he was facing the very real possibility of losing everything, including his own life. The young man's thoughts swirled in a haze of pain and confusion as he lay on the cold, hard floor, his life slipping away. He had trusted Frankie, believed in his plan to escape the clutches of the FBI and the Don's criminal empire. But now, it seemed that their fates were inextricably linked, and the price they would pay could be far too high. As the sounds of the raid faded, the young man's mind drifted to the events that had led him to this moment. The chance encounter with Frankie, the dinner at the Don's mansion, the revelation of Frankie's dark secret.
It all seemed like a distant dream, a twisted nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. And now, with Frankie's lifeless body beside him and the FBI agents closing in, the young man knew that his own time was running out. He struggled to hold on, to stay conscious, but the pain and the blood loss were taking their toll. In his final moments, the young man couldn't help but wonder, what happens now? Where do I go from here? The uncertainty of his future weighed heavily on his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been irrevocably changed, forever altered by the events that had unfolded.
As the darkness began to close in, the young man's thoughts drifted to his family, his friends, the life he had left behind. He wondered if they would ever know the truth, if they would understand the circumstances that had led him to this tragic end. With a final, labored breath, the young man closed his eyes, accepting the reality that his fate was now in the hands of the FBI. Whatever happened next, he knew that the world he had once known would never be the same. The chapter ends with a shocking and devastating twist, leaving the reader in a state of uncertainty and curiosity about the young man's ultimate fate. By focusing on the emotional impact and the visceral details of the scene, the narrative creates a sense of tension and immediacy that draws the reader in, making them invested in the protagonist's struggle. The use of simple conversational language helps to make the events more accessible and relatable, while the unresolved ending leaves the reader craving more. The young man's eyes fluttered open, his vision blurry and disoriented. The sharp pain in his shoulder was now a dull ache, and he could feel the warmth of a bandage covering the wound. As his senses began to clear, he realized he was no longer in the dimly lit room where the FBI agents had cornered him and Frankie. He blinked a few times, taking in his surroundings. He was lying in a comfortable bed, in what appeared to be a small, cozy room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a warm, golden light filtered in through a nearby window. Slowly, the young man tried to sit up, wincing at the slight throbbing in his shoulder. As he did so, a figure moved in the corner of the room, and his heart leapt in his chest. "Frankie?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stepped forward, and the young man's eyes widened in shock. It wasn't Frankie, but rather an elderly woman, her kind face etched with worry. "Easy now," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You've been through quite an ordeal." The young man stared at her, his mind racing. "Where am I? What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman smiled sympathetically. "You're safe, my dear. You're in my home, resting and recovering." The young man's brow furrowed. "Recovering? But what happened to Frankie?" The woman's expression darkened, and she let out a heavy sigh. "I'm afraid Frankie didn't make it," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. The young man felt his heart drop, the memories of the shootout flooding back. No, that can't be," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. The woman reached out and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm so sorry, child. Frankie sacrificed himself to save you." The young man stared at her, his mind racing. "But why? Why would he do that?" The woman's eyes softened, and she gave him a side smile. "Because he cared about you. And he couldn't bear the thought of you being dragged into his family's mess."
The young man felt a lump forming in his throat, the weight of Frankie's sacrifice weighing heavily on him. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "Why did this happen?" The woman sighed, her expression turning serious. "I'm afraid the truth is much darker than you could have imagined, my dear." The young man felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned in, her voice lowering to a whisper.
The Don, Frankie's father, he was not the only one with a secret. There was someone else, someone with an even darker agenda, who had been pulling the strings all along. The young man's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman's gaze grew distant, her expression etched with a mix of fear and resolve. Frankie's mother, the woman the Don had an affair with. She was no ordinary criminal. She was a high-ranking member of a powerful international organization, one that had been using the Don and his empire for its own sinister purposes. The young man felt his breath catch in his throat. But how is that possible? Frankie said the Don had her killed. The woman shook her head, her eyes filled with a haunting sadness. That's what the Don wanted everyone to believe. In reality, she was very much alive, and she had been manipulating both the Don and Frankie for years, all in service of her organization's twisted agenda. The young man stared at her, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. If that's true, then what does that mean for me? Am I still in danger? The woman's expression darkened, and she squeezed his hand tightly. I'm afraid so, my dear. You've been caught up in a web of deceit and betrayal that goes far beyond the Don and his empire. And now that you know the truth, you've become a liability they can't afford to leave alive. The young man felt his world crumbling around him, the reality of his situation sinking in. He had thought he was free, that he had escaped the clutches of the Don and the FBI, but now he found himself facing an even greater danger. What do I do? He asked, his voice trembling. How can I protect myself? The woman's expression hardened, and she leaned in closer. You must run, child. Run as far and as fast as you can. These people, they have eyes and ears everywhere. You can't trust anyone, not even the authorities. The young man's head spun, his mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. But where do I go? How can I possibly outrun an organization like that? The woman's gaze grew intense, her grip on his hand tightening. There is one place, one person who might be able to help you. But you must act quickly, and you must trust no one else. The young man felt a glimmer of hope, but it was tempered by the overwhelming sense of fear and uncertainty. Who can help me? The woman's eyes darted around the room, as if she feared they were being watched. There is a man, a former member of Frankie's mother's organization. He's gone rogue, and he's been working to take them down from the inside. The young man's heart raced. Where can I find him? The woman's expression darkened. I can't tell you his name or where he is. That would put both of us in grave danger. But I can tell you this. If you want to survive, you must find him. He's the only one who can help you now. The young man felt a surge of desperation, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. But how? How do I even begin to find him? The woman's eyes met his, her gaze unwavering. You must trust your instincts, child. They will guide you if you let them. And remember, you are not alone in this. Frankie gave his life to protect you, and his sacrifice must not be in vain. The young man felt a wave of emotion wash over him, the reality of Frankie's death hitting him like a ton of bricks. He had been thrown into a world of darkness, and now, with Frankie gone, he was truly alone. But as the woman's words sank in, the young man felt a spark of determination ignite within him. He would honor Frankie's sacrifice, and he would find a way to escape this nightmare, no matter the cost. With a newfound resolve, the young man nodded, his eyes filled with a steely determination. All right, I'll do it. I'll find this man, and I'll take down Frankie's mother and her organization, once and for all. The woman's lips curved into a small, sad smile. I wish you the best of luck, child. You're going to need it. As the young man prepared to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread and uncertainty. The path ahead of him was shrouded in darkness, and he had no idea what challenges he would face. But with Frankie's memory as his guide, he knew that he couldn't give up, no matter what. With a deep breath, the young man stepped out into the world, his heart pounding in his chest. He was about to embark on a journey that would test him to his very core, but he was determined to survive, no matter the cost. The chapter ends with the young man resolving to pursue a dangerous path, one that will pit him against a powerful and sinister organization.
The introduction of Frankie's mother and her mysterious connections adds a new layer of complexity and intrigue to the narrative, leaving the reader eager to discover the truth and the young man's ultimate fate. The emotional weight of Frankie's sacrifice and a sense of dread and uncertainty surrounding the young man's future create a palpable tension that draws the reader in and leaves them craving more.
The use of simple, conversational language and relatable emotions helps to ground the story and make the protagonist's struggle feel all the more real and immediate. The young man stepped out into the dimly lit street, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The weight of Frankie's sacrifice was heavy on his mind, but he knew he couldn't afford to dwell on it now. He had to keep moving, to find this mysterious figure who could help him escape the clutches of Frankie's mother and her powerful organization. As he walked, the young man's eyes darted back and forth, constantly on the lookout for any sign of danger. He knew that he couldn't trust anyone, not even the authorities, and that the slightest misstep could be his undoing. After what felt like an eternity, he reached a nondescript building tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The woman had told him that this was where he could find the man who might be able to help him, but as he approached the door, he hesitated, his nerves getting the better of him. What if this was all a trap? What if the woman had been lying, and this was just another way for Frankie's mother to get to him? The young man's mind raced with 1,000 different scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. But then he remembered Frankie's words, the way he had sacrificed himself to save the young man. He couldn't let his friend's sacrifice be in vain. Taking a deep breath, he steeled his nerves and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The interior of the building was dimly lit and sparsely furnished, but the young man could feel a sense of tension in the air. As he made his way down the hallway, he noticed a door at the end, a faint light spilling out from underneath it. Hesitantly, the young man approached the door and knocked, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment, the door swung open, and the young man found himself face to face with a grizzled-looking man, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Who are you?" the man growled, his voice rough and gravelly. The young man swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. I was told you could help me," he stammered. The man's expression didn't change, but he stepped aside, gesturing for the young man to come in. The young man swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how much he could trust the stranger. It's about Frankie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And his mother." At the mention of Frankie's name, the man's expression changed, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. "Frankie, huh?" he said, his voice low. "I should have known that name would come back to haunt me." The young man felt a surge of hope, but he also couldn't help but feel a twinge of fear. "So, you know him? And his mother?" The man nodded, his gaze darkening. "Yeah, I know them. Or at least, I thought I did." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "That woman, she's a real piece of work, let me tell you." The young man felt his heart racing, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. "Please, you have to help me," he pleaded, his voice laced with desperation. "I'm in over my head, and I don't know what to do." The man studied the young man for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Why should I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "What's in it for me?" The young man felt a wave of panic wash over him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Please, you have to help me," he said, his voice trembling. "Frankie sacrificed himself to save me, and I can't let that be for nothing." At the mention of Frankie's sacrifice, the man's expression softened, a flicker of emotion passing across his face. "Frankie, huh?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Damn kid always did have a knack for getting himself into trouble. The young man nodded, his eyes pleading. "Please, you have to help me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where else to turn." The man studied the young man for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Finally, he let out a long sigh and nodded. "All right, kid, I'll help you,"
he said, his voice gruff. "But you better be prepared for one hell of a fight." The young man felt a surge of relief, but he couldn't help but feel a twinge of trepidation. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man's expression hardened, and he leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Frankie's mother, she's not just some run-of-the-mill criminal," he said, his voice low. "She's part of a dangerous organization, one that has its fingers in all kinds of dirty business." The young man swallowed hard, his mind racing. "What kind of organization?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man shook his head, his gaze darkening. "It's called the Syndicate, and they're not the kind of people you want to mess with," he said, his voice laced with warning. "They've got their claws in everything, from politics to the underworld, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their interests." The young man felt a chill run down his spine, his heart pounding in his chest. "But why me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why are they after me?" The man sighed, his expression weary. "Because you know too much," he said, his voice somber.
You've seen things, heard things that they can't afford to let out. The young man felt a wave of panic wash over him, his mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. "So, what do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression hardened, and he leaned forward, his gaze intense. "We fight," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We take the fight to them, and we don't stop until we bring the whole damn thing crashing down." The young man stared at the man, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "But how?" he asked, his voice trembling. "They're so powerful, and I'm just one person." The man's lips curved into a grim smile. "That's where you're wrong, kid," he said, his voice low. "You're not alone in this. I've been fighting the Syndicate for years, and I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." The young man felt a surge of hope, but he couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. "But what if we fail?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if they find us and—" The man's expression darkened, and he reached out, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Listen to me, kid," he said, his voice firm. "We are not going to fail. I've got a plan, and if we play our cards right, we can take these bastards down for good." The young man felt a sense of dread and uncertainty wash over him, but he also couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. This man, this mysterious figure, was his last chance at redemption, at finally putting an end to the nightmare that had consumed his life. "All right," the young man said, his voice steady. "What's the plan?" The man's lips curved into a grim smile, and he leaned back in his chair, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "Well, kid, it's gonna be one hell of a ride." Over the next few weeks, the young man found himself thrown into a world of intrigue and high-stakes espionage as he and the mysterious man, whose name he now knew was Jack, worked tirelessly to uncover the Syndicate's secrets and bring them down. It was a treacherous journey, filled with narrow escapes, heart-pounding confrontations, and unexpected alliances. The young man found himself pushed to his limits, forced to confront his own fears and doubts as he navigated the dangerous world of the Syndicate. But through it all, he was driven by the memory of Frankie's sacrifice and the knowledge that he couldn't let his friend's death be in vain. He was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. With Jack's help, the young man had managed to infiltrate the Syndicate's inner circle, gathering the evidence they needed to bring the entire organization crashing down. As they stood outside the Syndicate's heavily guarded headquarters, the young man felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew that this was it, the moment of truth.
If they failed, the consequences would be dire, not just for him, but for countless others who had fallen victim to the Syndicate's machinations. "You ready for this, kid?" Jack asked, his voice low and intense. The young man nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. With that, they launched their attack, using their hard-won intelligence to outmaneuver the Syndicate's forces at every turn. It was a fierce and bloody battle, but in the end, the young man and Jack emerged victorious. the syndicate's empire crumbling around them. As the smoke cleared and the dust settled, the young man stood amidst the rubble, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and a lingering sense of sorrow. He had done it. He had brought down the syndicate and avenged Frankie's death. But the cost had been high, and he knew that the scars of this ordeal would never fully heal. Looking up, he saw Jack approaching, a grim smile on his face. "You did good, kid," he said, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Frankie would be proud." The young man felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thanks, Jack," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they walked away from the ruins of the syndicate's headquarters, the young man couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. It had been a harrowing experience, one that had stripped him of his innocence and forced him to confront the darkest corners of the world. But in the end, he had emerged stronger, more resilient, and with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that the shadows of his past would always linger. But he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever challenges lay in store, and that he would never again be alone in his fight. As he and Jack disappeared into the night, the young man felt a sense of closure, a weight lifted from his shoulders. Frankie's sacrifice had not been in vain, and the young man was determined to honor his memory by living a life that was true to himself, no matter what the future held. The story ends with the young man and Jack walking away from the ruins of the syndicate's headquarters, a new chapter in their lives about to begin. The young man has faced immense challenges and sacrifices, but he has emerged stronger and more resilient, ready to confront the shadows of his past and forge a new path forward. The bittersweet tone of the ending, with the lingering sorrow over Frankie's death, balanced by a sense of closure and determination, creates a poignant and satisfying conclusion to the narrative. The simple, conversational writing style maintains the emotional resonance and relatability that has characterized the story throughout, leaving the reader with a sense of catharsis and a deeper appreciation for the protagonist's journey.